Hello and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the Siegel Executive Director of the Washington Institute, and a belated Happy New Year to all. I'm very happy to convene today's session to mark the agreement on a ceasefire in Gaza. After many months of tortuous negotiations, Israel and Hamas, through indirect negotiations, held with the Qataris, the Egyptians, and of course, the Americans in an unusual mix of outgoing and incoming administrations, seem to have crossed the finish line in time for the implementation, at least the very beginning of implementation, of a ceasefire in the now more than 15-month-long Hamas-Israel war on the last full day of the Biden administration on Sunday, January 19th. What is in the ceasefire? A three-phase agreement. In the first phase, we see the release, at least the beginnings of the release, of 33 of the hostages taken by Hamas and its fellow attackers on October 7th, 2023. We don't yet know how many of those 33 will come out alive. We know that in the first phase, that in beginning on day 16, the parties will begin to discuss what happens in phase two. So all these months of negotiation were really only about phase one, and we will see what happens and whether indeed we even get to phase two of this three-phase agreement. But to get into all the details, to find out what the implications are, what that means for Israel, for Hamas, for the outgoing Biden administration, and especially for the direction of policy for the incoming Trump team, I'm delighted to welcome a panel of Washington Institute experts. Joining us from his home, where he's dealing with a bit of a midwinter cold, is Ambassador Dennis Ross, our Davidson Distinguished Fellow, former Special Envoy, Presidential Envoy for Middle East Peace. Dennis, thanks for joining. On my right is Dr. Matthew Levitt. Matt Levitt is the Institute's Fromer Wexler Senior Fellow and Director of our Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. Matt, of course, is the author of a best-selling book on Hamas. And on my left is Naomi Newman. Naomi is a visiting scholar, a visiting fellow here at the Institute in her second year with us. She comes to us after years of service as the Director of Research at the Israel Security Agency, better known as the Shin Bet, where she had an intimate look at all aspects of Palestinian politics. So we have great knowledge, great insight, great depth to take a look at the Gaza ceasefire and what it means for American policy. You will have a chance to get into our discussion after the opening remarks by our panelists. Please do that in one of two ways. If you're on Zoom, you know the routine. Go to the Q&A function of the Zoom bar and put in your question. If you're not on Zoom, joining us through one of many other platforms, please email me directly at rsatloff, RSATLOFF, at washingtoninstitute.org. And I'll do my best to get your question into our discussion. With that, I'll turn to my colleague, Dennis Ross. Mute.
You hear me now?
I hear you now.
Okay. What I'd like to do is telescope a number of critical points, I think, that help to explain where we are and where we may be going, including some of the implications it has in the region as a whole with regard to American policy. But I want to start with what I call the Trump effect. Let's understand that the framework agreement that has been worked out was basically presented to President Biden in May by the Israelis. He embraced it. He turned it into a Security Council resolution. Hamas did not respond to it until early July. But basically, from July to what we have now, there is very little change in terms of the actual content or the language in it. I call the Trump effect, I identified as the Trump effect as the kind of the key that produced the end result. Why do I say that? I say it because basically, in the end, the president-elect, soon to be president again, had made it clear he wanted the war to end. And one of the things we saw starting in December, the negotiations seemed to get serious again, but they didn't conclude until, as we saw this week. And it involved, as Rob said, a kind of unusual degree of cooperation between the outgoing administration and the incoming one. Steve Witkoff, who is the designated negotiator on the Middle East for President Trump, flew last week out to Qatar, joined the negotiations, and then flew from Doha to Jerusalem to see Prime Minister Netanyahu. And by all accounts, he said to him, "You have to say yes to this, and it will not be understood if you say no." So we saw already that it's very difficult for Prime Minister Netanyahu to say no to President Trump. But we also saw what I think were clear indications that both Qatar and Egypt put much more pressure on Hamas. And I think the reason they did so was to sort of prove to President Trump that they could do things that mattered to him and they could deliver, and they were looking to put themselves in the right place with him in terms of the relationship. So number one, we have the Trump effect in terms of getting the deal done. I will suggest to you that notwithstanding how fraught the implementation process is likely to be, because there are multiple questions which we can get into in the Q&A, different issues where the potential for different interpretations is quite real. Having said that, I still think we're going to continue to see the Trump effect. And what I mean by that is that the fact that the Trump administration's negotiator was part of the conclusion of this, and it was agreed that the U.S. with Qatar and Egypt will not only be monitors, they will be guarantors of the implementation of this agreement. Now, what that means is if Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is saying to his cabinet, especially to people like Minister Smotrich, we have not committed to ending the war, we will resume the war. I think it is easy for him to say that right now. I think it'll be very difficult for him to do it unless Hamas is violating the agreement. Now, maybe Hamas will violate the agreement, but if they're not violating the agreement, and I think they actually have a very strong incentive not to do so, then it will be difficult for him to do so, because then he will be walking away from an agreement on which the United States and the Trump administration is a guarantor. So that actually gives me some reason to be somewhat hopeful that this process that's beginning will actually be one that will be carried out. Now, it is interesting, even as I say that, we have seen publicly from the incoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, we've seen from the incoming National Security Advisor, Mr. Waltz, we've seen that they've said, use the same words, we're going to destroy Hamas. That may be easier to say than to actually do, because if Hamas is not violating the agreement that the President of the United States actually wants to see implemented, there are questions here about how this would be done. Now, I do have suggestions for how it can be done. I think it is very possible that you can make Hamas wither. They've already been dramatically weakened by Israel. They're no longer an organized military. They've lost most of their military infrastructure, the weapons depots, weapons labs, weapon production facilities. Most of that is gone. More than half of the tunnels are gone. So they're dramatically weakened, but they still control Gaza today. So the key is going to be twofold. One, the smuggling has to stop. No smuggling from Egypt into Gaza. Anybody who's seen the captured equipment knows and thinks about 350 square miles of tunnels, knows that Hamas got whatever it wanted. Gaza may have been an open-air prison for the people who lived there. It was certainly not an open-air prison for Hamas. So the smuggling has to stop, and that will have to be a function of a U.S.-Egyptian understanding, where the Trump administration makes it very clear it's a test of the relationship with us, but we can also give the Egyptians a set of incentives by allowing them to be those who take the lead in the reconstruction of Gaza. That can mean a lot of money for Egypt. But there's another dimension to this as well. The other dimension is you have to choke off all the funding, all the money to Hamas. Matt has spent a lot of his career dealing with issues like that. I'll let him address that if that's something that he wants to take up. But the point is, organizing on a multilateral international basis, choking off the money, that's another way to make sure that Hamas basically withers. There's a third element here. The third element is that the reconstruction has to be done in such a way with monitoring that if there's any diversion of material at all, the reconstruction stops. Now, that leads me into the issue of, well, someone has to replace Hamas. And it's not something that Israel can create. There was a lot of work done over the last 6 months by the outgoing administration on trying to put together what could be an interim or transitional administration. We know the Emirates have said publicly they were prepared to be involved, to join a stabilization force. Egypt would certainly play a role. Morocco might play a role. There are a number of Europeans, including the Italians, who are prepared to play a role. The Arabs, however, to play this role, not only want the Palestinian Authority to invite them, they want them to have some kind of ongoing role. Part of what Bibi's position has been publicly is that the PA will play no role. Now, here there's a gap. You're going to need, if you don't want a vacuum, if the Israelis are actually going to withdraw because the full implementation of this agreement requires that, someone has to take the place of the Israelis. This kind of an interim administration, I think the Trump administration will find is very much in its interest. So they will end up, I think, having to bridge the gap here on what the role of the PA is. To be fair, especially I think from the Israeli standpoint, you have a PA that is corrupt and very weak, is in no position to play any kind of meaningful role in Gaza, at least at the beginning. What is going to be required is there has to be genuine reform on the PA side, of which there's been really very little. Now here, I would also say there's an Arab role to help produce this. One other factor that will lead President Trump to want to ensure that the agreement is implemented is he knows one of his priorities is Saudi normalization with Israel. He will not get the Saudis even to begin the process if Israel is not out of Gaza. The imagery that comes out of Gaza may not be seen in Israel, but it's seen in the rest of the region, and certainly in Saudi Arabia. Now, if he is emphasizing the need to get the Israelis out of Gaza as part of being able to move on Saudi normalization, which is, he says, is a priority for him, he can also ask something of the Saudis. The Saudis need to take the lead in ensuring that the Palestinian Authority actually undergo real reform. We've seen it happen before. In 2007, the Bush administration effectively told Abu Mazen that there was going to be reform and that Salam Fayyad needed to be appointed prime minister and empowered to carry out that reform, and he did. It was done before, it can be done again, and if there's any serious effort about wanting to talk about a Palestinian dimension to normalization, and if there's any real role for the PA to play in Gaza, there has to be reform, and there's an Arab role here to help produce it. All right, I will wrap up because I know there's a trap door here for me. So I'll simply wrap up with one last observation. It's going to be very difficult for Bibi to maintain his coalition as it is. If he goes ahead and he implements this agreement, certainly he will try to convince Smotrich to stay in by saying, we need to do this in Gaza and you'll get a free hand in the West Bank. I doubt seriously in the end he will have a full free hand in the West Bank because that will cost the issue of normalization. What will make it easier for Prime Minister Netanyahu to make these kinds of hard choices? Iran. If he sees and if he reaches an understanding with the Trump administration on how to deal with Iran and specifically what is the threshold nuclear weapon status that they have now. They don't have a weapon now, but they are closer than they've ever been. If there's a meeting of the minds on this issue, this is for Bibi the most important issue, has always been the most important issue for him. If he has that, then I think he will be prepared to make the adjustments that Trump might require on the other issues. I'll stop there.
All right, fascinating. So many different layers from the close-in discussion of Gaza and its implementation to the wider discussion of Saudi-Israel normalization to the even broader discussion of what to do about the regional challenge of Iran and its nuclear program. Linkages between one and the other. Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to turn now to Naomi Newman. Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. After Dennis talk about the American player, I would like to talk about the other two important actor between Israel and the Palestinians. I focus on Hamas, but I think there is another important player which called Abu Mazen of the Palestinian Authority, and I will ask two main questions. First of all, what happens? The question is in order to understand how did we get there and where are we going to? Because this is the main important things. So how come this deal that actually was put on the table already on May and the two sides rejected actually managed to work? And will it work until the end, all three phases? Another important question, how does this deal will influence Israel and the Palestinian and actually the narrative, the organized order in the arena between the river and the sea? This is there is very important question, and I will try to expand them. So I'll take now the Israeli player, and I think that in Israel we should talk about two elements. First of all, the public, the Israeli public, and the second is the government, or maybe I should be specific, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. So from the beginning, I think there was a consensus in the Israeli public regarding the hostages. Most of the Israeli wanted that the hostages will be released and they will be brought to back to home. Why? This is our norms. This is our values. This is our DNA. We value lives more than death. We talk about this in the past, but we have also obligation for the individual as a community, and therefore I think that when Israel in the last year didn't manage to bring hostages home, everybody understood that the concept that if we will put much more pressure on Hamas, we will manage to save the hostages, doesn't prove itself. So I think the more the information about the situation of the hostages arrived by videos on the picture, and we could see the physical and the mental situation of the hostages, the more we get this, the more pressure was put on the government and on Bibi. I think for a while, Bibi managed to put back all this pressure, to push back all this pressure, mainly because he had another pressure from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and other Knesset member that actually told him not to agree to this deal. But since November, and it's connected to what you said, Dennis, I think he has another source of pressure. This is the President Trump that actually asked or demand to close the deal until January 20. And Bibi didn't want to say no to Trump. Furthermore, I would suggest that Bibi even managed to convince himself, and he thought that he also managed to convince his partner that it's worth doing this deal right now. Why? First of all, he tells himself that he can, withdraw from this deal any moment, the second stage or even before. Bibi also understands that this war needs to change his phase, and there is more important target in this, on goals in this war. And if he will just manage to shut down the war in Gaza and Lebanon, as it was, he will be able to deal with the main arena his main goal, the Iranian arena, which he calls is the head of the snake, and he understands that we are talking, like everybody also in Israel and the Israeli public, we are talking about nuclear capabilities. And on top of this, or beside this, there are also other potential threats because of the war, which is Syria and Turkey, and we need to follow also these areas in order to, leave these threats very low and to focus on them. So Bibi tells himself, that's why I assume, he tells himself, I can be generous regarding this deal, and they say yes, and maybe I will get some dividend from this. And I think in this element, he thought he will convince Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. He said to himself, maybe Trump will agree to give some recognition in the settlement, maybe an accession with the Golan, and of course also the security aid. I think another reason that in the last months, and especially since the main event in Libya and Lebanon and Syria, Bibi believe that he's very strong, that he managed to put Israel in different position. We managed to regain capability, we managed to regain deterrence. We are not in the same position that we were on October 7, and therefore it's easier to deal with the negative consequence of this deal. And in the last, this deal will reduce the pressure from the families' hostages, and also from the public that demonstrate in the street of Israel. The other actor is Hamas. I know that Hamas is talking about the big victory, and I even heard the senior activists of the Hamas saying that we are willing to do again 7 October war. But when you check out this deal, and I won't elaborate too much about this, you can see that Hamas actually made compromises in this deal, and in a way, even Hamas crossed his own red lines. Furthermore, Hamas can talk about the total victory. It can talk about, I think, mixed between achievement and failure. Yes, Hamas managed to harm Israel. Yes, Hamas managed to put the Palestinian issue on the table, but he also has a tremendous failure. He didn't manage to unify the front. Hamas is no longer sovereign. It's something between terror organization and the guerrilla. Hamas cannot rebuild the Gaza Strip, and Hamas will be, from now on, depend on external elements and player, and Israel all the time will wait to see if it can rehabilitate itself. So Hamas understands its strategic position. It lost all his strategic support, and actually, beside the Houthis that managed to launch almost every night a rocket, he doesn't have a real strategic pillar to count on. So why deal now? Mainly because Hamas, and I think this is the main issue, Hamas understands that the value of the card, so-called hostage card, is decreasing every day. And we are coming to the winter, and these hostages won't survive in the condition in the Gaza Strip in the winter, and therefore the price of corpse, and I'm so sad to say this, but the price of the corpse is lower than the alive hostage. I think that Hamas also afraid that United States will put pressure on Qatar and Turkey, not allow Hamas to be in their state. And another constraint is the humanitarian aspect in the Gaza Strip. The situation in Gaza Strip is disaster. Even people that support Hamas asked Hamas to stop the war because of the ruin, because of the poverty, because of the disease, and because of the winter. So I know that the narrative now, when I read in the Palestinian networking is in the Palestinian public is, yes, Israel managed to ruin our house. Israel managed to kill us, but Israel didn't manage to kill the resistance. The resistance is here to stay. So this is the narrative right now. I think that the main failure of Israel is that we didn't manage to find alternative, like you said, Dennis, we didn't manage to find alternative to the Hamas. And another failure is we didn't manage to change the mindset of the Gazan. And they think that Hamas is their ruler. They think that Hamas is here to stay. And I think this is the the main failure of Israel. But there is another player, which is actually, I think, got the main knockout in this war and in this deal especially, and this is the Palestinian Authority. Actually, the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen specifically, they didn't join the war, although Hamas called them in on October 7th to join the war, and they didn't. Nowadays, the Palestinian Authority try to reduce the chaos and the terror in the northern Samaria. Abu Mazen all the time get against Hamas, and it didn't get any dividend. Israel even didn't share with them all these deals. Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority stay beside. And from Abu Mazen's point of view, actually the situations got back to the October 6th. This is the situation right now. Israel is conduct negotiation with the Hamas while he's just beside, out of the picture. So if you ask to the next question, so actually, where are we going to? First of all, we will need to deal. We don't know. This is ongoing reality. We don't know how much from this deal will carry out. But it's clear that Hamas managed to survive and is now marketing the narrative that they won. Hamas will try hardly to rehabilitate itself and to has again their military capability. In a while, they will let other players to rebuild Gaza, but they are willing to take the civilian role again. So again, I'm repeat on this. If you won't find replacement or alternative to Hamas, Hamas will stay there. Now, another important thing is what is going to be with the prisoners that Israel will release, which are very important. And I want to say that in the past, we tried some of them when we released prisoner. Some of them we tried to expel them outside, like Salah el-Aruri, and it wasn't good. With some of them, we managed to expel them to Gaza Strip, and it wasn't good. I'm still thinking that the right things to do is to expel, to leave them, especially the one from the West Bank, to go back to the West Bank, and we will be able to monitor them, to follow them, and to see if they've continued to deal with terror attack. We will manage to deal with them. And regarding Abu Mazen, I think that if Israel will manage to conduct this deal, we will have to give something to the Fatah in order to kind of balance between Hamas and Fatah. I think that in this arena, Hamas and Fatah continue to play zero-sum game. And while if Hamas will get all the card and Abu Mazen will be left with nothing, I think that it will be the narrative that only resistance managed to force Israel to gain more, to give more and more dividend to the Palestinian.
Okay, thank you. That's a sobering message when we think about the future of the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Thank you very much, Naomi. Again, if you want to get into our conversation after we hear from Dr. Levitt, please send me an email directly to rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org or use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Matt, the floor is yours.
So as far as I'm concerned, Dennis and Naomi were the people who came with the good news, and I'm going to tell you how it is. First of all, I want to kind of think a little bit about the the threats that are going to have to be dealt with as a result of the ceasefire. I want to talk a little bit about assessing Hamas's strategy, because while I don't think that Israel and the West have had a holistic strategy, as both Dennis and Naomi have said, there really is, as of now, no plan for what comes next after Gaza. I think perhaps it might not be conventional wisdom, but I assess Hamas as so far having a strategy, adhering to it, sticking to it, and being very happy with it. And that may surprise some, given the fact that they really have had the stuffing kicked out of them. But that was not something that was unexpected. And I'll end where my colleagues ended, which is that we need an alternative governance structure in Gaza. And if you don't have that, it will not be as bad as it is now. It will be worse, and it will feed right into Hamas's strategy, as I'll explain. So first of all, in terms of the tactical situation, first of all, it seems that under the deal, the Israelis are going to maintain a presence, perhaps with some redeployments along the Philadelphia corridor, precisely as Dennis laid out, because of the concerns about smuggling. The Netzarim corridor going across the Gaza Strip will not remain as it is, but the buffer zones will. So in other words, the IDF will prioritize the ability to protect Israeli communities that were attacked on October 7th. They will prioritize efforts to prevent Hamas from being able to rearm quickly, as it will attempt to do, as Iran will attempt to do. We even see, by the way, in the northern arena, reportedly, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham just confiscated an Iranian shipment of drones and other equipment intended for Hezbollah in Lebanon. So even in complicated places, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham doesn't think very much of Iran or Hezbollah. They will continue to push the envelope and try and do what they may. So they will definitely continue to do that. And in the moment, there'll be a ceasefire. I think it's incredibly important to appreciate the fact that my assessment is, from the Israeli perspective, that's all this will ever be, a ceasefire. The people, the terrorists who are being released, some of them with a significant amount of blood on their hands, some very, very dangerous people. The Israelis are not simply going to let them out of prison and watch them go and close the file. As Naomi said, they're going to be watched very, very closely. And I think a lot of them are going to have targets on their back. The Israelis are in a completely different place post-October 7th, and I fear they're about to be at an even more different place come Sunday and the implementation of the deal. I think we're going to find out that there are a lot of people who are going to be sent back dead, not alive, potentially some very, very sensitive hostages. If the Bibas babies are not returned alive, the reaction within Israeli society is going to be fierce. Israelis are going to be getting in onesies and twosies trickles of people coming back, and much larger numbers of Palestinians, including hardened terrorists, will be released. People are very, very attuned to the history of the Shalit deal, where a significant number of people were released, and many of them, including Sinwar himself, became very much involved in what became October 7th. So I don't believe for a moment that this is going to close the file. And I think what you're going to see ultimately, and if things go swimmingly, is an end to full war hostilities, but night raids of the type that we've been seeing in the West Bank for quite some time in the Gaza Strip. And I see that even if there is some type of other force that comes in, because at the end of the day, I do not expect the Moroccans or the Egyptians or the Emiratis or the Italians or anybody else to go after Hamas, because Hamas will shoot back. And the only people that will be able to do that, and they will absolutely do it in my assessment, are the Israelis. So there's a tactical reality in terms of dealing with Hamas in the context of this ceasefire. There's a strategic reality too, and here this plays into Hamas's strategy. Hamas's strategy was very clear. They wanted to relinquish governance. Governing the Gaza Strip was getting in the way of them being able to perform their jihad against Israel, which they think is achievable. And for all the losses and all the setbacks that they have experienced since October 7th, these were all things they were willing to do. They said many times, I feel uncomfortable letting the words pass my lips, but Hamas leaders, several of them, have said, we need the blood of Palestinians to spill to get public opinion. And as far as they're concerned, they have succeeded in that. So their military-industrial complex has been destroyed. Over time, they'll rebuild it. It took them some 17 years to get to October 7th. They'll be happy to spend that kind of time again. I disagree. Call me skeptical when Secretary Blinken says that the U.S. assesses that Hamas has recruited as many people as they've lost. And if they have, we're talking about young kids who are joining Hamas for pennies a day, and they're replacing hardened, skilled terrorists. It's just not the same thing. But for all of that, Hamas wanted to be able to fight, to be able to absorb Israel's punches, to have some number of people remain standing and take to the streets with their green headbands and waving flags and saying, we are here and therefore we are victorious. But I think it's something more than that. There is a long history, a long and painful history of Hamas engaging in kidnapping, not only as a means of punching Israel in the face, but also as a means of punching their political adversaries within the Palestinian space in the face as well. Kidnapping Israelis and then securing the release of a whole lot of people from a variety of different Palestinian parties in return has always been a way for Hamas to hit Israel and undermine their Palestinian political rivals at the same time. And I think they are seeking to do that now. Again, Israelis are going to get small numbers of people and small numbers of corpses. And in return, you're going to see waves upon waves of very dangerous people. You're going to see huge celebration on the Palestinian side and in Gaza. You are going to see limited celebration and a whole lot of sadness on the Israeli side. The people who come back alive are going to come back in broken conditions. And I think that that is something we have to watch out for very, very carefully, because Hamas's entire goal has been to relinquish governance, but to remain relevant and to be part of what comes next in Gaza. And so my anticipation is that their plan is that once the ceasefire happens and once Israel eventually withdraws from full-scale forces in Gaza, at some point shortly thereafter, they're going to say, okay, and now we don't even need to be the people running things anymore. They'll step back and it'll be seen to be this big concession from Hamas, when in fact, that's what they've been planning to do the whole time, so long as they can be part of what is next. And they want that because what they want in Gaza is the model Hezbollah used to have, and to a certain extent still has in Lebanon, where they are part of the governance structure, but they're also a part from it, with the difference being that they are able to maintain their independent arms so they can be part of the government, but continue to do things targeting Israel. I think you're going to see a transition from full-scale war to counterterrorism missions. And I think that at the end of the day, to finish where Dennis and Naomi took us before, if we don't have some type of alternative government in the Gaza Strip, then Hamas will say, you know what? I don't even need to fully give up governance. I can run the things that I want to run. And so I applaud the opportunity to secure the release of as many hostages as possible, of course. Long, long overdue. But I think we need to appreciate the challenges that are about to come. And for the incoming administration, it's going to be very, very challenging, because they don't want new Middle East wars. They don't want to be bogged down in things. They want this to stick, but they don't not mean it when they say total victory against Hamas. I agree with Dennis. I don't think they fully appreciate what the slogan means and that the slogan is not a policy. But giving Israel free rein to do things, and the Israelis are saying that the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration have given them some indication that they will allow them to do things, that they will provide them the weaponry to do things. Balancing this, I anticipate, is going to be a little more complicated than maybe some have said publicly.
Okay, well, thank you. Very important message. Indeed, there's a continuity of messages from all three of my colleagues, and it focuses on the urgency of creating an alternative in Gaza If indeed the Israelis and the world want to take advantage of military successes, they only become truly strategically valuable if a political alternative emerges to replace, supplant, take the role of Hamas as the de facto government in Gaza. I'll only add to that at a certain an additional wrinkle will happen if indeed it gets fully implemented. Additional wrinkle on January 30th when the Israelis, in the middle of phase one of implementation of the Gaza ceasefire, also implement the new legislation severing Israel's ties with UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency in Gaza. No love lost for UNRWA. My only point is that it is another wrinkle of complication for service delivery in Gaza. Actually, it would, if indeed the Israelis withdraw from all the built-up areas within Gaza and are only on the periphery, who actually does food distribution and delivery and safeguarding this becomes an urgent question, and how they mix these two, implementing phase one and implementing this legislation, becomes an extremely complicated undertaking unless there's an alternative that emerges in the next 2 weeks. All right, with that, we have three very substantive presentations. We have quite a few questions that have already come in. Let me ask the big picture question to get everyone's blood a little bit boiling even more than it might already be. And that is, half a dozen people asked me this very simple question. Are we going to get all three phases of this deal implemented? Or what is the likelihood that for one reason or another, whether it's gross violation by Hamas, whether it's political calculation by the Israelis, or some mix of these two, we get a return to hostilities well before the full implementation of these three. Quick comments on each of these. We'll begin where we ended off. Matt, you go first.
I'm too smart to answer that question straight, so I won't. I do think that there are vested interests in seeing the stages go through. The Trump administration wants this to happen. The fact that Trump administration's envoy to be was a direct participant in these talks tells us a lot. I could see a situation where the Israelis feel that Hamas has not done something necessarily that violates the agreement, but someone really, really bad comes into their crosshairs. They pick up a plot that Hamas is preparing for behind the scenes while they're saying something else, and they take the opportunity to take that strike and feel that maybe the Trump administration will be understanding of that, given the where they come from. I also think there's going to be a whole lot of lawyerly semantics here. What is a violation and all of that. So I think there's lots of ways that this can be delayed. To me, the biggest issue is we are supposed to, over the next 6 weeks, begin to, or in fact, come up with this, what comes next. And that's just not enough time.
Not enough time to get to phase two, given that the negotiations only start day 16 of phase one. Okay, Naomi, what's your view?
Since the game changer and the one who decide that the deal will done, I think that it's depend on Trump. And only on Trump. So if Trump won't convinced that Hamas did something terrible to Israel or move from the deal dramatically, I think that this deal will done.
Will go on.
Yes.
All right. It's all up to Donald Trump. Dennis, your view?
I share Naomi's view. If Donald Trump is really serious about not wanting to see wars on his watch, he's going to put enormous pressure to ensure that it doesn't reemerge. So I do think a lot depends upon how close attention he is paying to this. One thing I think will be key for the Israelis, they need to be working hand in glove with the administration, especially the intelligence people in the administration, precisely to deal with the kind of scenario that Matt was raising. So if they say, look, here's what the Hamas is doing, I can see that being brought to Trump's attention, and then Trump's attitude is, okay, Hamas needs to pay the price. So my guess is he wants to see this implemented. A lot will depend, as I said before, how careful is Hamas in terms of biding its time. I suspect they will bide their time because they also understand now is not the time to continue this. So I lean towards the idea if Trump is paying a lot of attention, this likely gets implemented.
Okay, well, so we have people leaning towards full implementation. I'll throw my 2 cents in. I lean towards this thing falling apart, only because I think there are some such vague terms in some of the aspects of the implementation of this deal. For example, there's a commitment in the agreement that civilians can return from south to north. They promise not to have any weapons, but there's no inspection to ensure that they have no weapons. Well, I can drive a truck through that commitment.
Rob, this is the difference between principles and specific issues. The principle is much more, in this case, I think, much more important than the details.
So my only point is, we'll see how that gets implemented. I can imagine it hitting a roadblock, but I take the point very well that the key new ingredient is this 900-pound gorilla in the White House who pushed this over the finish line. I say that with all affection, of course. All right, lots of questions. Let me turn to some questions for everyone here. So, for example, actually, let me ask you, Matt. We know that Hamas is, of course, the principal Palestinian interlocutor partner for this agreement, but there's also Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Have they signed up? Do we expect them to play by the same rules and principles as Hamas, or is there any daylight between this smaller, even more Iran controlled organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Any daylight between them and Hamas?
There often is, but right now I don't anticipate there will be. They have been in Doha, briefed on what's been going on. The statements they've made have not been negative. Now, Hamas is a larger movement and has been able to continue to make money off of some of the humanitarian goods that have been brought in. Hamas has more infrastructure, more people. The past 16 months have been harder on the smaller Islamic Jihad, that have also been hit very hard. So I think Islamic Jihad actually in some ways might want the deal even more. But at the end of the day, it's not just a question of Hamas Incorporated, Islamic Jihad Incorporated. You have individuals across this entire spectrum. And if one person decides to do something and shoot off a rocket, things can go in a lot of different ways. But the bottom line is I think Islamic Jihad is not going to try and be a spoiler in the moment.
Okay. To you, Naomi, I think you might have mentioned this in passing, but during these final couple of weeks of negotiations over Gaza, there's been a rarely reported on story in northern Samaria where the Palestinian Authority, really for the first time in quite a while, has been forcefully taking on Hamas and other radicals within, especially within refugee camps in the northern part of the West Bank. Is this earning any rethinking in the Israeli establishment about the potential role of the Palestinian Authority as a partner for what might be necessary in Gaza, or is this just being dismissed?
Just been dismissed. Although I think that, and I'm aware of the incapability of the Palestinian Authority. I think that now Abu Mazen, as opposed to the first term of Trump, is willing to negotiate with Trump, to talk with him, to try to convince him that he can handle the West Bank, that he can go back to Gaza Strip and to deal with this arena. This is what Abu Mazen is focusing in the last few months, and I think it's almost decade since we saw the Palestinian Authority is willing so much to deal with chaos, anarchy, and terror. And I think that with the help, I know that Israel has not good alternative in Gaza Strip, but I think that we need to give some help. It's mean Israel and the United States, Emirate, the Arabs, Sunni need to give help to the Palestinian Authority in order to prepare this Palestinian Authority to be ready in the future to go back to Gaza Strip and to take the responsibility in the civilian aspect. Israel, of course, will be all the time, all over in order to deal with the military aspect, but the Palestinian Authority, with a little help, can do it. We don't have a good alternative, as I said. This is the less bad opportunity.
So, Dennis, let me ask you. You've spoken with. You just returned from several weeks in Israel. You've spoken with the broad range of Israeli political and national security leaders. There is a disconnect in the sense that as Israel goes down this agreement, the prime minister will have to compensate the Smotriches and the right wing of his coalition with even tougher positions regarding the Palestinian Authority, regarding the West Bank. But yet the logic of this agreement is that Israel will be out, at the end, if it gets phased in, as you suggest, Israel will be out of Gaza. So then when you talk to senior Israelis, what is their image of what will be in Gaza if there's no PA and they're out?
Well, you actually put your finger on it in terms of implying, which I will now say explicitly, there's a difference between the security establishment and the political leadership. The security establishment does not see an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, with all of its weaknesses even now. The political leadership basically can't say Palestinian Authority, because after all, it's had two ministers who would like to see the Palestinian Authority disappear. Now, Bibi, as he tries to work out, he's trying to certainly keep Smotrich in the coalition. He's going to lose Ben Gvir, but he's trying to keep Smotrich. And the way he keeps Smotrich is by promising two things. We'll resume the war, and I'm going to give him more of a free hand. He's not going to do anything that would look like he's trying to bolster Palestinian Authority. Exactly the opposite of where the security establishment is. What you heard Naomi saying is exactly what you hear in the IDF, and I would say in Shin Bet as well, because they're looking at the practicality. If you don't create a Palestinian alternative in Gaza, then inevitably Hamas will come back, and they're attracted to the idea of this transitional phase. But they see even now, they would be granting more to the PA, even now, than the political leadership, in part because they also want to find ways to build the credibility of the PA before the Palestinian people. So their attitude is we can't leave a vacuum, because if we leave a vacuum, everything we did will be for naught. And in effect, what Matt was saying, we will make it easier to play into Hamas's strategy. Why would we want to make it easier to play into Hamas's strategy? But the politics of the coalition right now argue against that. Here's where we see the Trump effect, potentially.
And just to take it to the next step, is it really only the prospect of a Saudi deal that gives a way out of this conundrum? And if the Saudis don't do it, the Israelis can just continue to be faced with this conundrum as far as the eye can see?
Well, the Saudi element is important because it's what builds President Trump's interest in this issue. If he didn't have the prospect of the Saudi normalization, I'm not sure he much cares about what happens in Gaza, as long as he doesn't face a continual war that is a distraction. But the Saudi normalization is a key here, because the changed mood in the region, and certainly in Saudi Arabia, given the imagery coming out of Gaza, requires them to be concerned about what happens in Gaza and requires them to emphasize more the Palestinian dimension. So if they're basically conveying to President Trump, look, we're prepared to do all sorts of things, but it has to start with Gaza, then his administration has to have more of an interest of what begins to emerge there.
But my point being that this was really the only issue one can imagine that would give Netanyahu the rationale to shift gears completely.
I think I would actually put more emphasis on Iran. Yes.
On Iran.
Yes. And I think for President Trump, Saudi normalization is proof that he's a peacemaker and he's transformed the region. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, that's highly desirable. But Iran has always been his Winston Churchill issue. And I think when he looks at Iran and he looks at where they are in terms of their nuclear program, he understands something has to happen in the year 2025. And he can rationalize in his mind, I can make these tactical adjustments on these other issues, because in the end, this is an existential question as it relates to the state of Israel and even to the Jewish people. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu defines himself in those larger, more heroic terms.
Hold on one second. Matt, a number of questions on Hamas decision-making. Israel has done a very significant job of decapitating Hamas leaders over the last 15 months. Sinwar, Deif, et cetera. Who is actually making these decisions for Hamas on these issues? And do they have, what sense of authority do they have today compared to, the authority that Sinwar wielded after October 7th?
Naomi and I are smiling at each other because this is something we talk about all the time. But the first thing I would say is it's important to recognize that the extent to which the Israelis have decimated Hamas leadership is nothing like what they did to Hezbollah's leadership. And so Hamas still has a significant number of its middle leadership. On the battlefield, less so. Sinwar's brother, Mohammed Sinwar, is reportedly the guy who is on the ground in Gaza organizing things. And Khalil Ahia and his guys in Qatar and elsewhere are still functioning as well. So yes, the Israelis have taken out several key people. Yahya Sinwar, probably the most significant. But Hamas decision-making is still there. Ehud Yari and I co-authored a piece just a few months into this crisis, maybe 12, 13 months ago, about the tensions, historical and current tensions within Hamas decision-making circles. Those are still there, but in the moment, they are still able to function as decision-makers in ways, I think, that if you look at Hezbollah, they can't quite the same. Naomi, you want to add?
Yeah, I agree. I think that if it's changed because Yahya Sinwar has gone. Because before that, as long as Yahya Sinwar was in life, he was the one decision making in this process. And now I think in a way it's returned to what it was before Yahya Sinwar took over Hamas. We have Khalil Khia. Also Khalil Khia, you have to remember, he came from the Gaza Strip, which means the Gazans are still the dominant element, but I think that Mohammed Sinwar is not like Yahya Sinwar, and he deal with the people in Doha and also in Turkey in order to get kind of a consensus. So and they still have two main military a figure that also he consult with them. Mohammed Sinwar consult with them, so they still have kind of management that they do something like consulting inside and outside.
Okay. A question to both Dennis and Naomi. Both of you you all referred to the essential role eventually, if there's going to be an alternative, an essential role of the Palestinian Authority, the urgency of reform to make that a palatable alternative. Just can you give our viewers just a sense of the enormity of this challenge, how much time would be involved, would be necessary? Let's say even tomorrow, Mahmoud Abbas says, okay, Naomi Newman, your definition of reform, I'll do it. How much time would it take for the PA to implement stuff to be at a point where it would be, as you said earlier, Dennis, an acceptable, legitimate partner to begin to do stuff in Gaza? Because this stuff, I mean, we're talking about a ceasefire that's getting implemented this weekend. So connect the schedules here. How long would, even in the best of circumstances, would this take?
So it depends what is your model. And I think how much you're willing to compromise. I think that we have no time to wait until the Palestinian Authority will act, by the book, and will have good governance, and will have mobility, and will be strong regarding the military aspect and deal with Hamas. It can take months. We need them to go out to Jordan and Egypt and to train themselves. We need that they have support in the economic issue. We need to change the education aspect. We need them to do
that's years.
Yes. But the question is not when we are going to have perfect Palestinian Authority that is capable to deal with the West Bank and then go by horses to the west, to the Gaza, and then to take over. This is not the case. We don't have alternative. So I'm telling you, between the alternative of Somalia and alternative of, Palestinian authorities that, on train job, how you call it, it's just managed to do its best with the help of United States, the Sunni Arabs, and Israel. This is what we got.
So even in the best case, the best case would take how long?
Months.
The best case is
between months and years.
Okay,
Dennis? But I think we have to think about it a little bit differently. We have to think about what will send an immediate signal to everybody. First, Palestinians on the ground and people who would be prepared to support them on the outside. What would send that signal immediately would be the appointment of a new, empowered, independent prime minister. For example, if you were to appoint Salam Fayyad, the immediate message would be, okay, everything has changed. He's been empowered, he's doing things. So literally from that day one, you will begin to see changes, and it becomes clear that they're now on a pathway to reform. Go back to 2007 when he came in a similar situation. People tend to forget at the time, the Fatah had just lost, the PA had just lost Gaza. The West Bank was completely lawless. And within a few months, he had basically reimposed order, in fact, law and order in the West Bank. He had opened up the financial system, the budgeting process, investment process. So looking to a complete result isn't the way to think about it. Seeing that the path has been launched in a way that is highly credible. And by the way, Palestinian people, if they saw a truly independent person appointed as prime minister, they would know something fundamentally had changed. And so would those on the outside. What Naomi said about you need the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others to invest in that new person. And the Israelis have to act in a way that makes it possible for that person to succeed. Then you have a process underway. So I wouldn't measure it in months. I look at it in terms of changing the reality by the symbolic appointment, which tells everybody we're on a completely different track.
But there's still a time schedule involved.
There is, but everything is complicated. So, the point is not to say, okay, it's too hard to do. The point is, okay, what do we have to do and when do we have to do it?
I think that the huge question is Abu Mazen capable to do it? This is a huge question. He's willing to do this, but I think he's part of the problem. Don't forget it. He's part of the problem. He's not willing to go beside. I think if he was, he would say, okay, I will have some symbolic role and we will let a new generation to change these things. I will still sit in the West Bank and I will send my people to the Gaza Strip and Salam Fayyad and maybe Dakhlan, and we'll do this changing. maybe it could happen, but I think that the picture is too complicated because there is some stagnation in this
Naomi,
Palestinian Authority.
it will only, look, he will not do it willingly.
Mhm.
It will only happen if he invests, he looks at the Saudis and if they were the Saudis, if the Saudis were to come to him and say, here's what we are prepared to do, including to help on the political process with the states, and here's what we're prepared to do with President Trump, but this is what's required from you. We require, and I would have them give the candidate and say, this is what has to happen. You will remain, but you assume a symbolic figurehead role. I mean, I think that's the only way this happens. Otherwise, it's not going to.
Okay, very good. All right, we're coming to the close of our time together. Just a question or two more. I know you've written about this, so let me ask you, Matt. We've seen the emergence of some external actors. Turkey obviously is the major external actor in what happened in Syria. Do you expect the Turks to play any, the newly emboldened, ambitious Turkey? Will it play a role in the Gaza context? And how do we interpret Qatar's role in all this? In the end, the American envoy, Steve Witkoff, went and worked with the Qataris. When we look back on all this, part of the problem, part of the solution, the Qatari role in all this.
Two really easy softball questions. So look, I think the Turks would like to play a larger role, but Turkish-Israeli relations are not at an all high right now, and I don't think the Israelis will welcome that. And the Turks have their hands full with a couple of things closer to home. For the U.S. and for the incoming Trump administration, one critical thing, Dennis mentioned this in his opening remarks, and I definitely sidestepped it, is that we need to not only do a lot more to prevent Hamas from being able to procure new weapons and rebuild its military-industrial complex, but also stop the funding of Hamas. And Turkey there plays an incredibly important role. The U.S. Treasury has designated key parts of the Hamas Finance Committee that are based in, including the leader, based in Turkey. They have designated investments in Turkey, and the Turks have made it clear they have no intention of acting on those sanctions, and that's a big problem. And I think that a Trump administration would have a lot more leverage on moving that ball forward than the Biden administration did. So I see this as a point of tension, actually, more than of opportunity. The Turks wanted to play a more positive role. There are things they could do. Look, I think a lot of people are frustrated that so many officials are praising Qatar because of Qatar's role in the ceasefire, and they see a lot more of activity that Qatar does that they're disturbed with. These can be both true at the same time. I think one of the things to watch, if the ceasefire actually goes through all of its phases, whether that's on time or otherwise, and I should have said, by the way, that while I don't think there's enough time within this 6 weeks to negotiate fully what comes next, the deal actually is clear that it can be continued. I do think that when all is said and done, it'll be interesting to watch how much of a serious conversation does the United States have with Qatar about the future of Hamas leadership in Qatar. At one point, Qatari officials were under enough pressure that they actually leaked to the press that we can't do that now. We need them here so we can negotiate the hostage release, the prisoner release. But when all is said and done, they're clearly going to have to go. And there'll be a discussion about that. And frankly, there'll be discussion here. Do people want them to go? Maybe you still want them someplace where you can reach out to them. I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure to push them out. Remember, there are 3 rounds of FBI investigations in this country. One, we've already sent indictments, and there'll likely be more of Hamas leaders, in part because some of those leaders are no longer with us. The second is of people in this country who were doing financing of Hamas. And the third is of the people actually on the ground on October 7th carrying out attacks that were targeting Americans and others. As the FBI continues to pursue indictments of Hamas leaders who are in Qatar, that could be increasingly uncomfortable for Qatar. And so we'll have to see what happens. But in the moment, I don't think anybody wants to rock that boat. They want this deal to succeed.
Okay. And just lastly for Dennis, and then this is a big hypothetical, but if you were advising incoming President Donald Trump, would you suggest to him, Mr. President, this is an area of great opportunity. Let's see what we can do, or would you say to him, you know what, the potential for this going the wrong way is too high. Let's just see how it works out, and then if the opportunity emerges, dive in again.
I would say, look, having just written an article about this, I would say the Israelis have transformed the balance of power in the region in a way that creates enormous possibilities. But like anything, it's like an earthquake. The earth will resettle. If you don't take advantage of the moment, you're going to find out when you miss an opportunity, you end up in a situation that's even worse if you hadn't had the opportunity at all. So yes, I would say you have to dive in. But one thing I would say, and it relates to the question you started with, Rob, about are we optimistic or not optimistic about the implementation? The key to this is the Trump administration is going to have a team that is really focused on this because of all the questions and details connected to this. If they're not focused on every detail, then this thing will come apart. It's fine and good for me to say the president has to remain interested, but he has to have a team that is working on this every day to make sure that it doesn't come apart if he wants to produce an outcome. And producing an outcome here opens up everything else.
Okay. Important final word. So thank you very much, Ambassador Dennis Ross, Dr. Matthew Levitt, Naomi Newman. Thank you all for joining us for this very special seminar here today to look at the Gaza ceasefire and its implications for U.S. policy as we make the transition in the final day of the Biden administration with the beginning, hopefully, of the implementation of this accord as we move on to the new Trump team beginning after inauguration on Monday, January 20th. Thank you for joining us at the Washington Institute.
Thank you.